It was 6:14 a.m. when the phone rang at the Millersville Police Department. The town was just beginning to wake up. A soft layer of fog hung low over the hills, and the streets were still mostly empty, save for the occasional jogger or early commuter. Detective Helen Granger had just poured her first cup of black coffee when the call came through. Her desk phone buzzed once, twice, then she answered with a voice still husky from the early hour. Detective Granger. Yeah, this is Rachel Benton. I I need to report my husband missing. The woman's voice on the other end trembled, not dramatically, but enough to make Helen sit up straighter in her chair. How long has he been gone? Helen asked, already pulling a notepad toward her. 2 days now, Rachel replied. I thought maybe he just needed space. But this isn't like him. He hasn't called, hasn't shown up to work, and his car is still in the driveway. Helen scribbled the name down. Rachel Benton. Husband, Jason Benton. Married couple, early 40s. Lived on the east side near Oak Ridge. All right, Rachel. I'm going to send a patrol unit over to your house to talk with you and take an official statement. Do you mind if I come along? There was a pause. No, that's okay. I want to find him. Detective Granger already had her coat on before she hung up. Something about the way Rachel said it felt off. Not the worry itself, but how controlled it was. She'd heard enough calls from panicked spouses to know what real fear sounded like. This wasn't it. Rachel Benton lived in a 2-story home with a gray shingled roof, a neat little yard, and a white fence that needed repainting. It looked like the picture of suburban calm. When Helen arrived with Officer Darrell Lewis, Rachel was already waiting on the porch with a cup of coffee in her hands. She wore a beige sweater, no makeup, her hair tied back. You must be Detective Granger, she said, voice a little steadier now. Thanks for coming so quickly. Of course, Helen replied, glancing over her shoulder at the parked patrol car. Let's go inside. The living room was clean, too clean. Not a speck of dust, not a throw pillow out of place. Helen noticed a single glass on the kitchen counter, empty. No signs of a man living here. No jacket hung by the door. No keys, no wallet tray. She turned toward Rachel, who stood stiffly near the fireplace. When exactly did you last see your husband? Friday night, Rachel said. We had a small argument. Nothing serious. I went to bed early, and when I woke up Saturday morning, he was gone. What was the argument about? Helen asked casually. Rachel took a sip of her coffee before replying. Just, money. Jason got laid off 2 months ago, and it's been tense around here. But he wouldn't just leave without telling me. Helen nodded, jotting it down. And when he didn't come home Saturday night? I thought maybe he needed time to cool off. He's done that before, once or twice. Gone to stay with a friend or take a long drive. But he always calls. Any family in town? Number his parents passed away years ago. His sister lives in Vermont. I texted her. She hasn't heard from him. Helen leaned back against the kitchen counter. Mind if I take a look around? Just a routine sweep. Rachel hesitated. Of course. Go ahead. She led Helen through the house. Bedroom, bathroom, basement, even the small shed out back. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing except the eerie feeling that someone had already cleaned up too well. Helen's gut told her she was missing something. No signs of struggle, but also no clues of where Jason could have gone. Back at the station, Helen pulled Jason Benton's record. He had a clean file. No arrests, no history of domestic issues. His last known employment was at a construction firm downtown, laid off in February. She called the firm. They confirmed he hadn't been back, hadn't called, hadn't picked up his final check. She ran his bank statements. No withdrawals in the past 4 days. His phone last pinged a cell tower just a few blocks from his home. Then it went dead. People don't just vanish, Helen thought. They get erased. And someone always holds the sponge. 2 days passed with no leads. Flyers went up. Local news ran a short piece. Rachel cried softly on camera, her hands clutched together like a churchgoer. Then Helen got a break. A man named Toby Harris called in, reporting something strange. He owned a small auto garage on the edge of town. One of his tenants, a guy named Brian Cole, rented the back storage unit for what he said was classic car parts. But lately, Toby had noticed a strong smell coming from the unit, like something rotting. Helen asked him to unlock the unit, then raced over with a forensic team. Inside, behind a stack of car tires and covered with an old tarp, was a deep freezer. When they opened it, the smell hit first. Then they saw it. A man's body wrapped in black plastic, curled in a fetal position, frozen solid. Helen didn't need dental records to know it was Jason Benton. As the crime scene techs began their grim work, Helen stepped outside and lit a cigarette, a habit she usually avoided. The garage sat quiet under a pale gray sky, the wind rattling a loose metal sign. She stared at the freezer like it had whispered something to her. Rachel had said Jason just disappeared, but his body had been right here all along, and this was only the beginning. The garage was quiet now, cordoned off with yellow police tape that fluttered gently in the spring wind. The freezer, once ordinary, was now evidence item. The ME's van backed in silently to receive the body, and Detective Helen Granger stood nearby with her arms crossed, watching every movement. She'd been on homicide for nearly 16 years, and this wasn't the first time a freezer told her a story. But this one, it felt personal. The dead man was positively identified within hours. Jason Benton, male, 44, married, no major health issues. His body had been wrapped tightly in industrial black plastic, with zip ties binding both ankles and wrists. No blood. No blunt trauma visible. It would take the autopsy to reveal more, but Helen already had a sinking feeling. This wasn't an accident. It was murder. Helen returned to the station around 9 p.m. The day had stretched long, and her desk lamp cast shadows across the paperwork starting to pile up. She stared at a fresh report from forensics. The freezer where Jason's body had been found. It had been wiped clean of prints, except for two partials. One belonged to Jason. The other, Brian Cole. The name hadn't shown up in Jason's known associates. So who was this guy? Helen pulled his file. Brian Cole, 38, no criminal record. Lived on the west side in a duplex apartment above a tattoo parlor. Self-employed as a handyman, low income, paid cash most months. And most notably, he was dating someone, Rachel Benton. Helen made the call to dispatch. I want an unmarked unit watching Rachel Benton's house, and I want a uniform on Brian Cole's apartment. Discreet but alert. If either of them makes a move, I want to know. By midnight, Helen had gathered enough threads to see the outline of something bigger. A man doesn't just vanish unless someone wanted him gone, and if he ends up in a freezer at the home of the man dating his wife, that's not coincidence. That's premeditation. The next morning, Helen met with the ME at 7:45 a.m. Time of death, she asked. Approximately 4 days ago, Dr. Little said. We're narrowing it to late Friday night or early Saturday morning. Same night Rachel said she last saw him. No signs of blunt trauma or stab wounds, but he had ligature marks on his neck, likely strangled with something soft, maybe a belt or towel. Helen felt her jaw tighten. Any signs he fought back? Number no defensive wounds. He might have been sedated. We're testing for that now. Helen nodded, mind already racing. Let me know when tox results come back. Later that day, Helen paid a visit to Rachel's house again. This time she brought backup and a quiet warrant in her coat pocket. When Rachel opened the door, Helen didn't bother with pleasantries. We found your husband, Rachel, she said flatly. Rachel froze. In Brian Cole's garage, Helen continued, watching her reaction closely. Inside a freezer. Rachel's mouth opened, then closed again. What? You want to tell me how your missing husband ended up dead in your boyfriend's storage unit? Rachel's hands shook now. I don't know. He said he'd handle it. She caught herself too late. Helen stepped forward, voice calm but firm. He said he'd handle what, Rachel? Rachel dropped into the nearest chair like someone had cut her strings. She began to cry, not the delicate tears from her news interview, but raw, uncontrolled sobs. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said through tears. I just wanted to scare him. Jason was angry all the time. He hit things. Not me, not usually, but the walls, the fridge, the car. I told Brian and he said we needed to stop it, that we couldn't live like this. Helen didn't say anything. She let the silence grow heavy. We didn't plan to kill him, I swear. I told Brian just to talk to him, just warn him. Maybe make him think someone was watching. But when I woke up Saturday morning, Jason was gone. Brian said he'd taken care of it. I thought maybe he'd scared him off. Helen's voice was cold. You never thought to check where Jason was? Never asked why his phone was dead? Why he hadn't touched his bank account? I didn't want to know, Rachel whispered. Helen stood up and nodded to Officer Lewis. Take her in, accessory at minimum. I'll handle Cole. That night, Helen knocked on Brian Cole's door. He answered wearing a flannel shirt, surprised but not nervous, until he saw the badge. Brian Cole? Yeah? You're under arrest for the murder of Jason Benton. His face paled instantly. I didn't kill him. Wait, I didn't. He attacked me first. Tell it to the judge, Helen said, cuffing him as two officers swept his apartment. Brian cracked within 2 hours. It was supposed to be just a confrontation, he said. I went to the house Friday night. Rachel let me in after Jason passed out drunk. I confronted him in the kitchen. He woke up, got violent. He shoved me. I panicked. I grabbed the belt from the floor. I just wanted to stop him from hitting me, but he wouldn't stop moving. I didn't mean to kill him. Then why wrap him in plastic and hide him in a freezer? Helen asked. Brian stared at the floor. Because I didn't know what else to do. Rachel, she was scared. I didn't want her to go to jail. I thought, I could fix it. You froze him like leftovers. Brian didn't respond. Jason Benton confirmed deceased. Code strangulation. Brian Cole confessed, charged with second-degree murder. Rachel Benton, charged with accessory to murder and obstruction of justice. Motive: domestic violence, fear, desperation, and poor decisions. Helen stood by the observation window watching Rachel and Brian sit in separate cells. Two people who made one awful choice after another, tangled in lies and frozen truths. But the case was closed. Justice, in its slow and imperfect way, had been served. The case should have been over. Brian Cole had confessed to the murder. Rachel Benton was locked up for her role in covering it up. And Jason Benton's body had been identified and processed. On paper, it was closed. But Detective Helen Granger wasn't satisfied. Something about Brian's confession nagged at her. He claimed it had been self-defense gone wrong, but there was no sign of a struggle, no bruising on his body, no evidence that Jason had even thrown a punch. The apartment had no scratches, no broken dishes, no overturned chairs. If Brian was attacked, it had been the cleanest, quietest brawl in history. Helen didn't believe it, so she dug deeper. At the precinct, Helen reviewed the forensics report again. The plastic used to wrap Jason's body was common, but the zip ties weren't. Heavy-duty, UV-resistant ties, often used in construction or electrical work. Brian was a handyman, sure, but when she checked his toolkit and van, none of the remaining zip ties matched the ones used on the body. More interesting, a search of Rachel's garage had turned up a half-used pack of the exact same brand, tucked behind a box of holiday decorations. Helen stared at the bag. It was almost too perfect. She called in forensics again. I want prints off this packaging and test it for trace, gloves, sweat, skin oils, anything. I don't care if it's microscopic. By Thursday morning, the report came back, no fingerprints. But what they did find was a single blonde hair stuck to the inside of the zip tie packaging. Long, dyed, female, Rachel's hair. Helen paced her office for a long while. Rachel had claimed she didn't know Jason was dead. She claimed Brian handled it, did everything on his own. But now the zip ties were pointing back at her, literally from her own garage. Helen returned to the interview room. Rachel looked worn. Her face was pale, her eyes baggy. I already told you everything, she said tiredly. I didn't kill him. Helen placed a photo of the zip ties on the table. These came from your garage, the same kind used to bind your husband's body. Care to explain that? Rachel stared at the image for a moment, then closed her eyes. I don't remember them. Brian didn't take them. There's no record of him being in your garage. But you were. And you were the one who texted Jason that night, remember? Come home. I forgive you. Let's talk. That message brought him back to the house. Rachel said nothing. Helen leaned in, voice sharper now. Did you plan to kill him? Rachel flinched. But I didn't plan to stop it either. Rachel began to talk, slowly, painfully. Jason had a temper. It started a few years ago. He'd drink too much and get loud. Never hit me, but he'd hit things. Doors, tables. Once he threw a glass against the wall. I was scared. Not all the time, but when he got angry, I couldn't breathe. Helen said nothing, letting the silence do the pulling. I told Brian everything. At first, he wanted me to leave Jason, but I said I couldn't. He wasn't always like that. Sometimes he was kind, funny. We'd been together for 16 years. I just wanted the anger to stop. Rachel clenched her fists. That Friday, Jason came home drunk. We fought. He accused me of cheating. He pushed me. Just once. I slapped him back and he stormed out. But he came back around midnight. That's when it happened. What happened, Rachel? Helen asked quietly. I let him in. We started fighting again. Brian was waiting outside. I had told him not to come, but he did anyway. When he heard the yelling, he came inside. Jason tried to punch him and Brian grabbed a belt, my belt, from the laundry room. He wrapped it around Jason's neck. I didn't stop him. I just stood there. I didn't even scream. Tears rolled down her face now. I watched him die. The room went quiet. Helen stood and gathered the file. Rachel looked up, mascara streaked on her cheeks. I'm charging you with second-degree murder, Helen said. You could have stopped him. You chose not to. You lured your husband back into that house. Rachel nodded slowly. I know. Later that day, Helen sat down at her desk, watching the evidence line up. Rachel and Brian hadn't just acted in the moment. There were traces of planning. The texts, the zip ties, the freezer, purchased 6 weeks prior under a fake name. But the credit card? Brian's. Helen had almost missed that. It was a slow, careful build towards something awful. This wasn't just a fight gone wrong. It was murder, cold, calculated, quiet. Case update. Brian Cole. Charges upgraded to first-degree murder based on evidence of premeditation. Freezer purchase, concealment plan. Rachel Benton. Charged with second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Helen closed the file. She'd seen a lot of bad over the years. Jealousy, greed, revenge. But this one was worse, because it wore the face of love. A woman trapped, a man in over his head, and a life stolen piece by piece, then buried in ice. Detective Helen Granger didn't sleep much after the latest confession. She couldn't. She sat in her living room, staring out at the dark street beyond her window, her hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee gone cold. The case of Jason Benton had shifted. No longer a spontaneous tragedy between lovers, but something deliberate, something far more chilling. Brian and Rachel's stories were close, but not tight enough. Their timelines overlapped, but key moments slipped through. Helen knew one thing for certain. When two people lie together, they almost always leave cracks in the story, and cracks always let light in. She was going to shine that light. It was the freezer that broke the case open further. Helen had already flagged its serial number during the crime scene inventory, and now she had her team trace the purchase back to a hardware warehouse in Louisville, an hour away from Millersville. Bought 6 weeks ago. Paid for in cash. Name on the receipt, Keith Miller. There was no Keith Miller in either Rachel or Brian's immediate circle. Helen ran the name through DMV records. Nothing matched. But when she cross-referenced the timestamp of the purchase with store surveillance footage, her hunch paid off. There on the grainy video, Brian Cole, wearing a ball cap and dark sunglasses, pushing a flatbed cart with the freezer. He was alone. Helen paused the footage and exhaled slowly. Brian had said everything was spur of the moment. A panicked accident, but he had bought a freezer big enough to hold a body a month and a half before Jason Benton's murder. That wasn't panic. That was planning. Helen pulled Brian's phone records next. His call history, texts, GPS logs, everything. He had deleted dozens of texts from Rachel, but Helen's tech team recovered fragments from a cloud backup. One stood out, Rachel, March 2nd, 2025. We need a way to make it look like he left. Brian, I have an idea. I'll take care of it. Don't say anything more. Helen printed it out and pinned it to her board. There it was. Intent, motive, coordination. She leaned back in her chair, thoughts swirling. What if Rachel hadn't just stood by that night? What if she had set it in motion? She brought Brian back into the interview room. This time, Helen brought the photos, the freezer receipt, the store footage, the recovered texts. She laid them out like cards in a losing hand. Brian stared at them in silence. You lied, Helen said plainly. You told us you acted out of fear. You said Jason came at you and you panicked, but you had the freezer bought 6 weeks earlier. You discussed making it look like he left. That doesn't sound like fear to me. That sounds like premeditation. Brian ran a hand through his hair. I didn't want it to go that far. But you planned it. I was protecting her, he whispered. Rachel told me Jason had been hitting her, that he threatened to kill her if she ever left. I believed her. I still do. Helen folded her arms. Did she tell you to kill him? No, Brian said quickly, but she didn't stop me either. She watched. I remember thinking, why isn't she calling for help? Why isn't she screaming or crying? And after it was done, she just said, now we're free. That's what she said. Helen's mouth tightened. And then she helped me wrap the body. She got the zip ties. She told me how to wipe the doorknobs for prints. Helen stared at him. You weren't protecting her, Brian. You were working with her. Back in the women's holding unit, Helen prepared to face Rachel one more time. She didn't plan to warn her, just present the evidence cold. I have surveillance footage of Brian buying the freezer, Helen said as soon as Rachel sat. 6 weeks before Jason's murder. Rachel blinked but said nothing. I have texts between you and Brian discussing how to make Jason's disappearance look believable. I also have Brian's full confession. He says you were involved from the beginning, that you helped wrap the body, that you cleaned the scene. Rachel's shoulders slumped. He said that? Yes. And that was when Rachel cracked, not with words but a long, shuddering sigh that seemed to empty her body. I thought it would be easier than this, she finally said. Not the killing. I didn't plan that. But the hiding. I thought, if he was gone, if we said he left, maybe people would believe it. He was already spiraling. The job loss, the drinking. I didn't think anyone would question it. You were wrong. Rachel looked up, her eyes rimmed with tears. I know. With both Rachel and Brian confessing to different aspects of the crime, Helen built the final timeline. February. Rachel begins an affair with Brian. Early March. Rachel tells Brian about Jason's abusive behavior and her desire to escape. March 2nd. They begin discussing a plan to make Jason go away. March 8th. Brian purchases the freezer under an alias. March 21st. Friday. Rachel texts Jason to come home. Brian waits nearby. March 22nd. Early morning. Jason is killed by strangulation. Rachel watches and assists with cleanup. March 22nd to 26th. The body is stored in the freezer at Brian's rented garage. Rachel files a missing persons report to throw off suspicion. March 27th. Anonymous tip, garage owner, leads police to the body. With all evidence documented, the DA moves swiftly. Brian Cole, first-degree murder, tampering with evidence, unlawful disposal of a body. Rachel Benton, conspiracy to commit murder, second-degree murder, obstruction of justice. Bail was denied for both. Helen closed the file late that Friday evening. It felt final this time. No more pieces left to chase. No more questions without answers. Jason Benton hadn't deserved to die. But the truth, however bitter, had been carved out of silence, lies, and frozen intentions. The courtroom buzzed with low whispers as the trial of Rachel Benton and Brian Cole began on a brisk Monday morning in June. Local news vans had parked outside the Millersville County Courthouse since dawn. Everyone wanted a glimpse of the couple at the center of the town's most shocking murder in years. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, from curious residents to Jason Benton's former co-workers. No one could reconcile the woman who tearfully reported her husband missing with the one now charged with orchestrating his murder. Detective Helen Granger took her seat just behind the prosecution's table. She wasn't one for drama, but this trial meant closure. Maybe not for Jason, but for the truth. Assistant District Attorney Marla Jennings opened strong. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this is not a case of self-defense. This is not a tragic accident. This is about cold, calculated murder, planned over weeks, carried out by two people who wanted one man out of the way." She displayed the timeline, the recovered texts, and most damning of all, the photo of the freezer and the hardware store receipt. Brian Cole, seated with his defense attorney, looked smaller than Helen remembered. His once defiant energy had been replaced with nervous glances and a clenched jaw. Rachel, by contrast, sat quietly in a navy blouse, her hair tied back. No makeup. She didn't look at anyone. The prosecution's narrative was airtight. Motive from years of alleged domestic abuse, a love affair turned deadly, the pre-purchase of a freezer, and the use of zip ties found in Rachel's own garage. Helen testified that afternoon, detailing the investigation. She spoke clearly, confidently, walking the jury through every step that led to the discovery of Jason's body. She watched their faces as she described finding him curled up and frozen solid. "Did either Rachel Benton or Brian Cole ever report Jason missing before March 25th? The ADA asked. "No," Helen replied. "Rachel filed the report only after the body had already been moved to the garage, and Brian never came forward voluntarily." "And when did the freezer used to store the body appear in Brian Cole's possession?" "About 6 weeks before Jason's murder." The courtroom was silent. The defense pushes back. Brian's lawyer, Thomas Crane, argued emotional manipulation. "Brian Cole was not a killer," he said to the jury. "He was a desperate man in love, misled by a woman, who painted herself as a victim. He believed he was protecting her from harm. It was Rachel who baited the hook. She reeled him in." Rachel's attorney went a different route, painting her as a frightened woman trapped in a volatile marriage. "Rachel Benton never planned to kill her husband," said Ellen Navarro. "She was scared. She told Brian to scare Jason, not murder him." They argued for lesser charges, manslaughter, accessory, perhaps even time served. But Helen knew juries. They didn't like liars. And both defendants had told a web of them. The most emotional moment of the trial came when Jason's sister, Melissa, took the stand. "My brother was many things," she said, her voice cracking. "But he didn't deserve this. If Rachel was scared, she could have left. There were shelters, there were options. But instead, they planned his death like a home project." Melissa had flown in from Vermont. She sat every day of the trial, front row, arms folded across her chest. Other witnesses followed. Co-workers who testified about Jason's recent behavior. Neighbors who heard the late-night arguments. Even Rachel's own co-worker who recalled Rachel once saying, "I'd be better off if Jason just disappeared." A phrase that hit hard when repeated before 12 jurors. But the biggest shift came on day 8 of the trial. Ada Jennings introduced a surprise witness, a local scrap dealer named Reggie Palmer. He'd come forward after recognizing Brian Cole on the news. "I saw that guy back in February," Reggie said. "He came to my place looking for an old freezer. Said it didn't need to work, just needed to be big and clean." "And what did you tell him?" Jennings asked. "I didn't have anything that size, but I told him to try Miller's Hardware in Louisville." It confirmed premeditation even earlier than investigators thought. February, not March. The prosecution's closing argument was scathing. Jason Benton didn't stand a chance. He was hunted, not by strangers, but by the two people closest to him, his wife and her lover. They lured him home. They strangled him while he was drunk and defenseless. Then they stored his body like leftovers and lied to all of us. Helen watched the jury, knowing those words would settle deep. The defense attorneys gave their final pitches, pleading for mercy, for understanding, for reduced charges. But they couldn't undo the mountain of evidence. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned. "On the charge of first-degree murder," the four-person read, "we find the defendant, Brian Cole, guilty." Gasps, murmurs. Brian sat frozen. "On the charge of second-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice, we find the defendant, Rachel Benton, guilty on all counts." Rachel closed her eyes. Helen sat very still. There was no joy in the result, only justice, hard-earned, long-awaited. Brian received life in prison without parole. Rachel was sentenced to 35 years, with eligibility for parole after 28. Melissa Benton spoke at sentencing. "You buried my brother's body, but the truth still came to light," she said. "You froze him like a secret, but secrets don't stay buried forever." As the courtroom emptied, Helen lingered a moment. This case had changed her, not because of its brutality, but because of the layers, how love twisted into fear, how desperation masked itself as innocence, how two people convinced themselves that murder was the only way forward. Jason Benton was gone, but the story, his story, was now complete, and Helen had made sure of that. 3 months had passed since the verdict. Millersville had returned to its regular rhythm, at least on the surface. The whispers had quieted, the reporters moved on, and the trial that once dominated every local conversation had faded into memory. But for Detective Helen Granger, the case still lingered like a bruise beneath the skin, deep, unhealed. Even when the news cycle ended, the consequences remained. Helen stood in the conference room of the Millersville Police Department with a group of detectives, analysts, and brass. It was the final debrief on the Benton case, part of the department's standard practice for high-profile investigations. The whiteboard still had photos pinned from the trial. Jason's final text messages, Brian's mugshot, the freezer. Captain Ruiz stood at the front. "Good work," he said, scanning the room. "This one was messy, public, the kind of case that gets eyes on us. You kept it clean, and more importantly, you got justice." He looked at Helen. "Granger, you saw the cracks before anyone else did. You called the bluff." Helen gave a nod, though inside she felt no pride, just the weight of it all. After the trial, Melissa Benton had invited Helen to visit Vermont. "You brought my brother home," she'd said. "The least I can do is buy you coffee." Helen took her up on it one weekend in September. She made the 6-hour drive. North, alone, windows down, the air cool with the season's early chill. They met at a small diner just outside Burlington. Melissa greeted her with a tired but genuine smile. "You look like someone who's seen too much," she said, pouring Helen a cup of coffee. Helen chuckled softly. "Guilty." They talked for over an hour, about Jason, about his childhood, about how she hadn't seen the man he became in those final years. Angry, withdrawn. She talked about the guilt. "I should have called more, should have visited. Maybe I would have seen something." "You're not the only one asking, 'What if?'" Helen replied. Melissa leaned forward. "You think Rachel really felt trapped?" Helen paused. "I think Rachel believed what she needed to believe. I think she told herself it was the only way out, and once she started down that road, she couldn't stop. But she had choices. She just didn't take them." Melissa nodded. "I don't forgive her, not for what she did, but I think I understand how people get lost. Still doesn't mean they don't deserve what comes." Back in Millersville, a letter arrived at Helen's desk, handwritten in careful, blocky strokes. It was from Brian Cole. Mailed from his cell at Jackson State Prison. "Detective Granger, you probably don't care to hear from me, but I wanted to say one thing. I wasn't a killer. I didn't start that way, and I didn't wake up that morning planning to kill anyone, but I let myself believe things that weren't real. I thought I could protect Rachel. I thought I was doing something noble, but I was just a coward in love with a fantasy. Jason Benton didn't deserve what happened, and I know I'll live with that the rest of my life. Tell his sister I'm sorry. Brian Cole." Helen read it twice, then tucked it into the file. She didn't reply. Some things were better left unanswered. Rachel Benton had been moved to the State Women's Correctional Facility in Lexington. Helen had no intention of visiting, but she did follow the psychological evaluation submitted as part of her intake. Rachel had been diagnosed with PTSD, anxiety, and depressive disorder. She had been placed in a therapy program designed for long-term inmates with histories of abuse, whether as victims or perpetrators. Still, Helen couldn't shake one moment from the trial. When Rachel said, "I thought it would be easier," that sentence haunted her. Rachel had wanted freedom, but instead she traded one cage for another. What the town remembered, Millersville had a short memory for tragedy. Life went on. The Bentons' house was listed for sale and quickly bought by a young couple with a newborn baby. The garage where Jason's body was found was emptied and rented to someone new, an electrician who knew nothing of its history. Local coffee shops stopped talking about the case. The neighbors who used to whisper in their yards went back to weekend BBQs and soccer games. But not everyone forgot. Helen was approached one afternoon in the grocery store by a middle-aged woman she didn't recognize. "You're the detective, right? From that murder trial?" Helen gave a cautious nod. The woman reached out and touched her arm. "I just wanted to say thank you. I knew Jason. Years ago. He wasn't always a good man. But he didn't deserve what happened." Helen nodded. "No, he didn't." Cases like Jason Benton's never truly ended. They just echoed into families, into communities, into the minds of those left behind. Helen thought about what justice really meant. It wasn't always satisfaction. It wasn't peace. It was weight, a burden. The truth cost something, always. She stood on her porch that evening, watching the wind move through the trees. Somewhere out there, another couple was falling apart. Another secret was being buried. Another quiet house held too many things unsaid. But for now in Millersville, the lies had thawed, and the truth, however cold, had its day in the sun. Winter crept back into Millersville by December. The air was sharp, the sky often gray, and the sidewalks frosted over by early morning. For Detective Helen Granger, it was the quiet season. When the calls slowed, the streets emptied earlier, and even the bad seemed to hibernate. But one thing Helen had learned in her 16 years on homicide: no matter how cold the world got, memory stayed warm, especially the kind forged by pain, love, and truth. Jason Benton's case was over, officially closed, verdicts rendered, sentences handed down, but echoes remained. And in this final stretch, Helen felt them all. December 20th marked 1 year since Jason Benton's death. Not the day he was found, not the day his wife cried to the cameras. The day he was killed, quietly, secretly, choked to death in his own home by the man his wife was sleeping with. Helen marked the date not because she needed to, but because justice didn't stop when the files were boxed up. She spent that day like any other. She brewed a too-strong cup of coffee, read reports, and sat at her desk, reviewing cold cases that hadn't yet been solved. But her mind kept circling back. So on her lunch break, she took a short drive out to the cemetery. Jason Benton's headstone was modest, gray granite, freshly cleaned, a small wreath laid by someone earlier that morning. Likely Melissa. Snowflakes danced in the air above the stone, clinging to the engraved letters. Jason Allen Benton, 1979 to 2024. Always building, always dreaming. Helen stood quietly, hands in her coat pockets. "I wish I'd found you sooner," she murmured, "but I hope this counts for something." Behind her, the wind howled low. She stayed a moment longer before turning back toward the car. She didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in stories, and this one still had something to say. Back at the station that evening, Helen found a small envelope waiting for her on her desk. No return address. Postmarked from Vermont. Inside was a note from Melissa. "Detective Granger, I just wanted to say thank you. One last time. It's been a hard year, but a healing one. I've been attending a support group for families affected by domestic violence. I met a woman who left her husband after hearing about Jason's case on the news. She said, 'If they can kill him and freeze him like meat, I can get out before it's me.' You saved someone. Maybe more than one someone. I hope that means something to you. I still miss my brother. I still hate what happened. But I don't lie awake wondering anymore. You gave me the truth. That's everything. Be well, Melissa." Helen folded the letter slowly and slid it into her coat pocket. Her eyes stayed fixed on the paper a little longer than usual. The truth. That was her job, her burden, and maybe, just maybe, her gift. A few weeks after sentencing, Helen had received one final update. Brian Cole had taken a plea for additional information. In exchange, he provided full disclosure on another cold case from 2 years prior, an unsolved disappearance from his former neighborhood. It wasn't connected to Jason's case, but it revealed something else. Brian had lied to himself more than anyone. He had always needed someone to protect, to fight for, to lose himself in. In the final transcript from the prison interview, Brian said, "I wanted to be her hero. I didn't realize until too late that I became the villain." That line stuck with Helen, not because it shocked her, but because it didn't. Rachel Benton had been transferred to general population in late fall. Her therapist noted she had stopped speaking about Jason altogether. She focused on gardening and books. No visitors, no letters. Melissa never reached out, not once. She was serving 35 years, but Helen suspected Rachel had stopped counting. In every interview since her sentencing, Rachel maintained one simple phrase: "I thought we could be free," a dream of escape that had cost everything. 1 week before Christmas, Helen finally boxed up the Benton case, a thick folder, worn at the edges, filled with evidence tags, transcripts, photos, maps, digital logs, and 2 printed confessions. She paused before sealing the box, then added something extra: Melissa's letter. It didn't belong to the case by technical standards, but it belonged to the story, and Helen wanted that piece preserved, not just for the record, but for the truth. She sealed the box, wrote the date across the label, and filed it on the shelf. Row 6, Shelf B, Box 311. Jason Benton, case closed. The story of Jason Benton wasn't about one murder. It was about a slow descent. 2 people who convinced themselves they had no way out. A town that believed the lie, a detective who kept digging, and a sister who refused to let silence win. Justice didn't undo the crime. It didn't bring Jason back. But it gave the living a map forward. And sometimes, in a world of cold endings, that was the warmest thing they could hope for.